Well, my name is Shannon Gibney, and I'm a writer, a professor, a mom, a friend, a weirdo, all kinds of things. And I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, born and raised in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So solidly a Midwesterner out here. And yeah, I identify as a mixed Black, transracial adoptee, and those experiences and those identities really inform everything that I write and how I approach what I write as well. What was the second part of it?
So did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
Yes.
I know you're a professor of English, so I know you must have always had a love of words, but.
Yes. I mean, basically, always say since I learned how to write, whoa, that fell down. That wasn't good. Stay up. Since I learned how to write, I have wanted to, since I learned how to read, I'm doing too many things at once, I have wanted to write. So my first published book was in first grade when we did, we made our own books, and mine was about strawberry shortcake. And I did illustrate it myself. My illustrations did not look as good as Charly Palmer's, who's the illustrator for my new book, Sam and the Incredible African and American Food Fight. But I did do my best. And I was lucky, a child of the 80s in elementary school and then 90s in high school. Public schools in Ann Arbor, Michigan were fully funded then. And I mean, I think the teaching pedagogy was kind of miles ahead because we were in this open school system. And so we had these publishing centers where I could create my masterpieces and share them with my audience. And so that was wonderful. That was wonderful for me. So I've pretty much always been writing and messing around in some sense with story.
And did you always, I mean, because one of the things that's really interesting about you is you write for all different kind of age groups. Did you always imagine that you would, or did you start off wanting to write like more for adults and then it was kind of a surprise for you to try picture books, or how did that happen?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think really in high school, that's when I really started reading, a lot of sort of like adult literary novels those were like my deep loves. And so I always had a sense that I wanted to do sort of like long form. I mean, I look back on, the voracious reader that I was as a child, and it's not really that surprising that I would also then later want to write for children. And then I have two children. I have a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they figure prominently in my work and I mean, influence pretty much everything that I do on the page and off. So writing for them is like also quite a treat as well. So no, I definitely, sort of started off like, okay, I'm going to write more for adults. I've got YA novels, but they're sort of like at the top end of like the crossover to adult stuff. And then so I have a co-authored children's picture book called Where We Come From, with John Coy, Sun Young Shin, and Diane Wilson, that came out in October. But we actually wrote that after I wrote my solo authored picture book, Sam and the Incredible African and American Food Fight. It just took Charly Palmer, is an amazing painter, and he painted each page, and it took him 6 years to do that. Yeah. So I mean, and the end result I think speaks for itself. I mean, when I saw the cover, I mean, I just was like, oh my God, this was so worth the wait. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I mean, that story is, I know we're going to get into this, but it's about my son and a cross-cultural family. And so, yeah, my son, who's now 13, I wrote it when he was 6. So he's like, my kids are like my biggest champions. They're so supportive of my writing. But yeah, my son was like, yeah, that's cute that you have all these other books, Mom, but where's my book? I'm waiting for it. It needs to come out. So he's very excited that the day has finally come when this book is now coming out. But yeah, I decide I don't like to do things that I already know that I can do. I get bored kind of easy. So I decided that, it would be fun as a novelist to try going from, 80,000 words to, in this case, 1,000, right? And learning a completely new genre where also part of the story is communicated through images. And, so that was a huge learning curve for me. But I think also too, I think because my experience as a writer and a human is so intersectional, I'm Black, but I'm mixed, and I'm an adoptee. And I think sometimes people feel bad for me when they hear me say like, well, I don't really fit in places. And certainly I think when I was younger, that there was kind of more of a rub to that. But the older I've gotten, I'm 48 now, like I think of it actually as an asset that I kind of don't fit in certain discrete categories because it just allows me to move between different communities, different cultural traditions, and even different genres. I feel like I don't really, and I don't know, it kind of sounds like I'm being facetious when I say this because I understand genre very well, and genre is very important. But one of my dear friends, Sun Young Shin, who's another wonderful children's literature author and poet, she says genre is a hoax, which I actually believe that. It's like these discrete categories that we set up, and we have to, right? I mean, it's useful, if you're a mom looking for something that's going to be appropriate for your 5-year-old, you're not going to want to, pick up Moby Dick. You're not going to go into the adult literary section, probably. So, I mean, I understand why we have these discrete categories, but I think anybody from historically marginalized communities knows that those categories mostly serve the dominant class. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Oh, I feel like we could do like a few hours because you raised so many wonderful topics because you write like it's about genres and who does it serve and playing around with different categories and going kind of in between. Because I think you're right. I think I'm about the same age. I think the conversation around intersectionality, which was not a word that even most of us used back then. I think the whole conversation has changed in a great way. I think we're going in a good direction. Like you said, that there's much more talk about this, and which is why, well, maybe we want to just jump ahead and talk about the book first, since it kind of segues really nicely into the book really centers on a cross-cultural family. And I think there are more and more, not that or maybe it's being talked about more and more, of families where they're mixed or cross-cultural. And like in the book, if I remember correctly, his father is from Liberia and his mother is African-American from Minnesota. And these are families that we usually don't see in picture books. So why did you make that choice to talk about a family like this? And what do you think that we all can learn from seeing more of these kind of cross-cultural conversations happening in a very intimate way? I mean, this is all in one family, although, we can kind of extrapolate to the larger community also.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely. I mean, this book came out of a lot of things, but it also came out of our family's experience. I'm divorced now, but my children's father is Liberian, and his sister lived with us for a few years as well, and was an integral part of the family, in the same way that the auntie here in the book is an integral part of the family. And actually, Nordbo also contributed her world famous tteokbokki recipe at the end of the book, which I really appreciated as well. But yeah, I mean, I identify as mixed race. So I'm half white and half Black. And when I was growing up in the 80s, there really weren't hardly any stories. I mean, I looked for them. And also the 90s, I mean, and still, you know, there's a lot more stuff now for sure out. And, you know, we're sort of at the pinnacle of, you know, mixed race families, mixed race kids, like there's more than ever before. But in terms of our discussion about culturally mixed families, particularly I would say of the African diaspora, it's still very, very like just low level. Like it's not there. There's just not a lot of stuff or even acknowledgement that like, wow, yeah, there actually is a big difference between African Americans who are the descendants of slaves and African immigrants, you know, or the children of African immigrants who have come from, you know, like here in the Twin Cities, we have a huge Liberian population, and we have like a huge Somali population, and so yeah, there are families, you know, there's plenty of families where there's this cultural mixing going on, and kids like mine who may not be racially mixed, but they're certainly culturally mixed. And so what does that mean, and how do these children kind of negotiate the everyday reality of something that can be so banal in families as food, but also as important as food, you know? And food is something also that is so cultural. It's so ethnocentric, you know, we don't even think about it, right? Like we, you know, I always say, you know, I never feel so American as when I'm, you know, in Liberia or in another country, right? And I'm just sort of like, well, I can't eat that. You know, like I can't, why, who would eat a snail? I can't do that, right? And then it's like, you sort of have to step outside yourself and think objectively, like, well, I eat things like yogurt all the time and I love them. And objectively, probably somebody like if they came from the moon or whatever would be like, why are you eating bacteria? You know, like what tastes good about that, right? So I just feel like, you know, just sort of watching myself negotiate some of this stuff in my own family, and then watching my son trying to figure out like, yeah, how do I obviously get the sustenance that I need, and then also sort of like ride this this middle line between, you know, my mom's food and my dad and my auntie's food. And you know, it's like Sam in the book, just like my son Boise, like, I mean, he likes both kinds of food. He likes Liberian food, he likes American food, but there's just not enough room in his stomach for all the food. And so, you know, he's kind of in a pickle, and excuse the pun, and and yeah, and you know, until his stomach starts talking to him like this, and they come up with a plan, you know, and he figures it out. And it's not some like grand gesture, right? Where suddenly the mom at the end is like, oh, I love all Liberian food. Let me eat all, let's come together and sing Kumbaya, you know, and it's not like the father is like, oh, you know what? I really want to eat all those tacos, like whatever. It's like everybody in the family is trying a little bit of everybody else's foods. And that's good enough. You know, that's a good enough place to start, you know? I mean, I always say like, these are problems or opportunities that we can move through and solve in our own families on our own. And I think it just, excuse me, it requires a little bit of humility, and also I think a little bit of not always thinking of home as the place where you are going to be centered. You know, I think a lot of us have this feeling like, well, I should just be able to go home and kick off my shoes and it's just all about me and what I'm comfortable with. And it's like, well, yeah, but also sometimes not, you know, sometimes it actually might be about centering somebody else, right? And that's okay. That's okay. because it'll come around again. You'll have your time. So yeah, I mean, it's a book that definitely, it's like Sam learned some really important things, but it's also like the parents, the adults are also, I hope, you know, shown to be learning something. But yeah, I wrote the book for my son because, I mean, most of the books I write are like that. It really is like that Toni Morrison quote, you know, when she's talking about the bluest eye and why she wrote it. And she's like, well, I mean, when you don't see yourself in the literature, you have to write yourself in. And so most of the work I do is about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so many kids are going to be able to see themselves in this book, whether it's specifically that mix of cultures or, because I think what it captures, I mean, for those who haven't read it, it's a really funny book. It's a really sweet book, but it does capture how kids a lot of times are caught in the middle, you know, between these two sides of the family. And this is, you know, where and like you said, it's so cultural, but it's also food is so emotional.
Yes.
And it's like he doesn't know how to pick and not hurt somebody's feelings. And he can tell whatever food he chooses, his mom's going to be sad or his auntie and his dad are going to be sad. And so he does come up with a solution. And like you said, it's not perfect, but it's a good enough solution. But also, I love that, like you said, that he's leading the way. And I think that's very empowering for kids that, okay, in this family, we're all going to be chipping in. We're all going to be having to do our part, and that kids can have something that they can show the adults. And I just think that must be so empowering for kids in any situation, you know, to read a book like this.
I hope so. I mean, I think like there's a way in which in most cultures, you know, kids are seen as sort of, I don't know, certainly not experts, you know, in their own lives, you know, and it's like, yeah, well, okay, kids are not experts in being adults because they're not adults. They're not experts in like the adult world and all the other things that it's really important for kids to have adults for. But it's also like, you know, with my own kids, for example, it's like, you know, I grew up, like I said, I was their age in the 80s. And now my son is getting into middle school, so like early 90s, and like Ann Arbor, Michigan. I mean, it was just a completely different school and community environment that I grew up in than my son, who's, you know, he goes to a middle school, you know, an urban middle school, and it's like, I don't know, I think it's about 25% Black, 40% Latinx, like 5% Native. And you know, all these kids have these different sort of like gender identities that really didn't exist when I mean, it just is sort of like, I just feel like as a parent, like, you know, a lot of times it's like the received wisdom is like, oh, well, mom knows best, dad knows best. But it's like, but not like, not about the reality that they're living, right? Like with and so for Sam, it's like Ancona, his little sister, you know, they're the only ones in the family that are actually like truly deeply bicultural, you know, and so really they are the ones that are going to have to lead the way for the family in this way.
I love that. That's a great way to think about it. I mean, in terms of this family, but for all of us, like you said, I mean, our kids are living in such a different world than we grew up with. That I think that's a good lesson, like you mentioned, the humility that you have to have. I think for us as adults to be able to listen to them in terms of what they're going through and the problems that they're dealing with, but also in terms of the solutions they come up with. Because like you said, I mean, it's very different than what we dealt with when we were kids. And I'm just looking at time because I want to be respectful of your time. And I like I said, I feel like we could go on and talk about so many different things. So I guess just to wrap it up, maybe just in general, if you could talk some about, you know, you say that you've written stuff for lots of different kinds of books. You've written for different ages. I mean, we're focusing on your children's books, but you've written your new children's book, but you've written a lot for a lot of different ages. And that kind of the common thread that goes through them all is about sharing untold stories. So maybe could you talk just in general about that, about, first of all, maybe what are some examples of where you still see gaps? I mean, of course, we talk a lot about how there needs to be greater representation in children's books, but what are the gaps that you still see, and what is the value to all of us when these stories are told for the people who are telling them, because I know you also work a lot with people to help them tell their own stories. What is so powerful about the act of storytelling? And then why is it so powerful for us as readers to have so many more of these stories told? Sorry, I feel like that was more like a
no, that's
question,
a really that's a great question. No, yeah, like I just feel like the purpose of writing and art is to create more space and more connections where there haven't been. And like I said, for somebody who has lived for better and worse, in sort of interstitial spaces, like the spaces between different groups. There, I mean, there's plenty of benefits to that, but one of the things that just feels like it just doesn't have to be like this. Why does it have to be this way? Is just this distortion field that gets created when you really don't see your experience represented in an authentic way, in popular culture, in literature, all of these things. And it just really starts to make you feel like a freak. I mean, as a transracial adoptee, I read or saw very little about that experience growing up. And then what I did see just felt really flat and off, but I could never actually articulate why until I became an adult and started actually studying it and found out that most of the literature written about adoption and adoptees was by white adoptive parents that didn't reveal their identities as such. And so, so these things just get really problematic. And then what also can happen is that on the other side, folks in the dominant class can come to feel like, their experience, which is just another human experience, is actually the quintessentially human experience. To be, for example, cisgender white male is like the human experience, and it's like, actually, no, there's lots of other ways to be human that are just as valid. And so, take a seat and read the book about the, Aboriginal woman who, gathers water every day and, is a nomad and, feeds her family and whatever. Right. So I just think like anything that doesn't further our view of what it means to really be a human being is just not useful as art. Like it's just not. And so, that's, to me, always I say, like the first and most important goal of art is to, sorry, people are texting me, is to tell the truth, and so, but the truth, as we know, is messy, it's multifaceted, it's complicated. And so you have to get at that, really like the vastness of that word and experience of truth. You're going to have to come at it from many different points of view. And again, the humility word comes in there, like you just going to have to just live your life and also your artistic life, knowing that like there's just going to be a lot of stuff that you don't know, and that your experience is just one experience, and so that is when you talk about also my work as an educator and a teacher and a mentor. I mean, that's a lot of it too, is just sort of showing people that it's not just that it's going to be good for them to tell their story, but the rest of us, it's good for us. Like we actually need to hear those stories too, because we're not like, and they're happening, and that's a problem that we don't know that, and we're living in this world. Yeah. Right.
And so thank you for sharing your story and all of the books that I really recommend. If you haven't read it, please go. You can go to the link in her bio. It's Sam and the Incredible African and American Food Fight. It's a really wonderful book, and she has many other books out as well that you should read. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And if anybody's joining us late, this is going to be up in a few minutes on Instagram, just as long as it takes me type up the caption. And normally it's also up on YouTube the same day, but the person who does that is unfortunately out of town, so it should be up by this weekend. But it will be up on Instagram just in a few minutes. So thank you so much. It was such a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.
Yeah, she won't fuck.